You can install and use analysis services in SQL Server 2012 in a variety of ways. Each server mode supports a different type of database using different storage structures, memory architectures, and engines. There's 3 that are now available. The multidimensional uses the analysis services engine from SQL Server 2005 and later, so that's still available, a lot of the same features. Then there's a tabular server mode. This uses the VertiPack engine that was introduced with SQL Server 2008 R2. It compresses data for storage and memory at runtime, and there's no dependency upon SharePoint. And then there's a PowerPivot for SharePoint storage mode. Each server mode supports different data sources, tools, languages, and security features. So you'll want to decide the features you need and research which mode is most appropriate. It can be quite a trade-off. Multidimensional supports the most design features and granular security features, but fewer data sources. You'll use SQL Server data tools for development with multidimensional and tabular, but PowerPivot for the PowerPivot for SharePoint mode. You can select the server mode at installation. If you want to support multiple server modes on the same machine, you need to put each in a separate instance of analysis services. Instead of BIDS, the Business Intelligence Development Studio, you'll now use SQL Server data tools for multidimensional data mining and tabular model development. And when you fire up data tools, you'll see that there are several analysis services project templates. One is the Analysis Services Multidimensional and Data Mining Project. You can use this template to develop the traditional type of project for analysis services, which is now known as the multidimensional model, and is the only model that includes support for the analysis services data mining features. Another is the import from server, multidimensional and data mining. And you can use this template when a multidimensional model exists on a server and you want to create a new project using the same model design. Another project template is the Analysis Services Tabular project. This is new, and you can use this template to create the new tabular model. You can deploy this model to an analysis services instance running in tabular mode only, one of those 3 server modes. And this project lets you import data from a database and includes a tabular model designer to shape the data as you need. Another project template is Import from PowerPivot. You can use this template to import a model from a workbook that's deployed to a PowerPivot for SharePoint instance of analysis services. You can extend the model using features supported in tabular modeling and then deploy the model to an analysis services instance. And then finally, there's an import from server tabular. And this template is appropriate when a tabular model exists on a server and you want to create a new project using the same model design. So let's take a quick look at how you can use data tools in order to create these different kinds of projects. Here I have the SQL Server data tools already loaded and ready to go. On this particular machine, I only have data tools installed. I didn't have a prior installation of Visual Studio 2010 before I installed SQL Server 2012. All right, so as usual, I'll come in, File, New Project, and select Analysis Services, and there you can see all of the available templates that I talked about. So I'll go ahead and create this project. I don't really care about the name. And this creates a tabular project. A tabular model is a new kind of database structure that Analysis Services supports. When you create a project using that template, Data Tools adds this model.bim file to the project and creates a workspace database on the Analysis Services instance. Then it uses that workspace database as a temporary storage for data while you develop the model by importing data by designing the objects that you need. One of the things you can do is use the Table Import Wizard in order to get data into this model. So I'll go up here to Model, Import from Data Source, and that fires up that Table Import Wizard. As you can see, there's a number of different sources that you can use for the data in this model. Microsoft SQL Server, SQL Azure, a SQL Server Parallel Data Warehouse, Access Oracle, Teradata, Sybase, and so forth. So I'm going to go ahead and read in data from SQL Server. I'm going to use my local instance of SQL Server 2012, and I'll import data from the AdventureWorks data warehouse. If I need to, I can set various advanced settings for the connection, and I can test the connection. Fairly usual stuff. And then I need to specify credentials that's used by analysis services to connect to the data source. So I can either use a specific Windows username and password or a service account. But I'll use the user that I'm logged in as. I hope I typed that in correctly, because it doesn't actually try to make the connection until I'm done with the wizard and it's ready to import the data. And then I can select from a list of tables or write a query. I'll just import tables, and I'll be a little bit lazy and just import the entire database. I can also use this button to select related tables to any tables that I've selected. And I can also click on the Preview and Filter button here. So for the selected table, it then allows me, field by field, set various filter conditions. And I can sort the data in various ways and begin to shape it a bit as it's imported into the model. I'm just going to accept all the defaults. But I can do that for each of the tables that I select to import. Then I'll click on Finish, and it goes out and starts importing all that data. And there we go. As you can see, it successfully imported all of the data. And I can close this, and it opens up the Tabular Model Designer. This designer displays all the data in the workspace. And here you can do things like rename columns. And here's where you can do things like rename columns, filter, sort the data further, and work with the data to shape it the way you need. And you have a tab down here for each of the tables that I imported. And as you can see, there's a number of dimension tables and so forth. The nice thing about the Table Import Wizard is that it automatically detects all the relationships between tables. You have a couple icons down here. This displays the grid view into the data, but there's also a diagram view. So I'll click on that. It takes a few seconds for it to discover all the relationships and draw the diagram. And now we have this nice user interface of the overall structure of the data that I imported. And as you can see, it automatically detected the relationships between the data. And I can customize the display. I'll talk about perspectives in just a moment. I can reset the layout and so forth. And I can zoom in and out to get an overall view of the diagram. And notice how as I zoom out, it rearranges itself so that it stays up in the upper left-hand corner, and I can see more of the model. And I can drill down as much as I want. If I want to create new relationships between the tables, I can drag a column from one table to another, and that'll automatically create a relationship. If I want to see all the relationships, I can come up here to Table and Manage Relationships and see all of the information about the existing relationships. And of course, these are the ones that the Import Wizard discovered in the database. And I can edit individual relationships as I need to customize the model. One small limitation is that you can create only one-to-one or one-to-many relationships. One nice feature is perspectives. So when you have a lot of objects in the model, you can create a perspective to display a subset of the model objects. And that lets users more easily find the objects that they need. So I can go up here into the Model menu and select Perspectives. And that lists all of the tables that I have in the model, and I can create a new perspective and select which tables I want to include in any particular perspective. And I can select different tables, whatever is appropriate for different views into the model. And then you can also separate each table into multiple partitions. When you initially load the data, each table consists of a single partition. But you can come up here to the table menu again and select partitions, and that's grayed out. Let me select a table there. And you can opt to define a different way to partition the data in that table. So that's just a small part of the design features that Microsoft has implemented for, in this case, the tabular model within Data Tools. And there's lots of other support for other kinds of models that you can create using the tools in SQL Server Data Tools. I want to talk a little bit more about two of the model types that you can create using analysis services, the tabular modeling and the multidimensional model storage. So with tabular modeling, it's a new type of database structure that you can create. And I just showed you a small view into that new database structure. It creates a workspace database so that as you work with the project in Data Tools, it automatically manages a workspace database, and that resides in memory. The project uses that database to store the data that you add to the project using, for example, the Table Import Wizard. And then whenever you view data in the diagram view or the data view, then Data Tools retrieves the data from the workspace database. In general, the model is secure by default. You have to create analysis services database roles and assign Windows users or groups to a role to grant users access to the model. And there's a number of permissions that you can use in order to authorize different actions that the members of these different roles can do. So there's none. A member can't use the model in any way. Read makes the model read-only for that user. Read and process lets a user query the data and execute process operations. Process lets the user process the data, but doesn't grant any permissions to query the data or view the model database. Administrator, that permission grants full permissions to query the data, execute process operations, view the model data in Management Studio, and make changes to the model. One nice feature of the designer within Data Tools is that before you deploy the model, you can test how it works by using the Analyze in Excel feature. In this case, Data Tools opens Excel, which of course has to be installed on the local computer, and creates a data source connection to the model workspace, and then adds a pivot table to that worksheet. Another nice feature is direct query mode. If you have a huge amount of data that's too large to fit into memory, or when you want queries to return the most current data, you can enable direct query. In this case, when you execute queries, then the model will retrieve data and aggregates directly from the source database rather than using data stored in the in-memory data cache. So using this cache provides faster response time. The tool has to continually refresh the cache with current data, and that may actually slow things down. And once you enable direct query mode, there are some design features that you don't have available anymore, including some data sources, calculated columns, some DAX functions, and Excel support. And then the other model type is the multidimensional model storage. This is pretty much the same engine as Analysis Services has had since SQL Server 2005. But there is a new type of storage for string data. And this is more scalable than it was in earlier versions of Analysis Services. In particular, the restriction to a 4 GB maximum file size no longer exists, but you have to configure a dimension to use this new storage mode. As you add more data to the database, the string storage file will grow as large as it needs to be to hold the data. But even though the file size limitation is gone, the file can only contain 4 billion unique strings or 4 billion records, whichever occurs first as you add data. There's also several new management features available in analysis services. One is event tracing. So this uses the SQL Server Extended Events framework to capture any event, and that provides an alternative to creating traces using SQL Server Profiler. And then you can execute XML for analysis, or XMLA, to create object scripts to enable tracing for specific events. There are also some multidimensional events that are new in SQL Server 2012. Things like locks acquired, locks released, locks waiting, deadlock, and lock timeout. So the tracing process stores the data it captures in a file and then continues storing those events until you turn it off. And then there are also some events available that let you monitor other server modes. So Vertipack SE query begin, Vertipack SE query end, direct query begin, and direct query end events. And then there's a resource usage event that is usable in any of the server modes. You can use that to capture the size of reads and writes in kilobytes and the amount of CPU usage. There are also some architecture improvements. You can deploy tabular and multidimensional analysis services instance on a server with a non-uniform memory access, or NUMA architecture, and more than 64 processors. You have to configure the instance properties to specify the group or groups of processor that the instance is going to use. And then there's some PowerPivot for SharePoint changes. These provide a much more straightforward installation and configuration process, way simpler, and a wider range of tools for managing the server environment. So that's a big help. So those are going to be a big help in getting the server up and running and keeping it running smoothly, particularly as usage increases over time. And then there are a number of enhancements in PowerPivot for Excel. This is a client application that incorporates SQL Server technology into Excel 2010 as an add-in. This updated version has a bunch of fairly minor enhancements, but they're nice that they improve usability that users can take advantage of. It also has some new features that make the PowerPivot model consistent with the structure of the tabular model. So the first thing that users are going to notice is the usability enhancements. These just make it easier to perform a lot of the tasks during PowerPivot model development. One is that there's lots of new buttons on the ribbon. On the Home tab in the View group, there's a Data View button and a Diagram View button that let you toggle the view of your model, just like I showed you within the Designer in SQL Server Data Tools. And there are buttons to toggle the display of hidden columns and the calculation area. Another nice new button is the Sort by Column button, so you can control the sorting of data in one column by the related values in another column. And then the Design tab includes Freeze and Width buttons in the Columns group, and that helps you manage the interface as you review data within the model. And then there's an Advanced tab of the ribbon. This doesn't display by default, so you have to click on the File button and select the Switch to Advanced Mode command to display this new tab. So you can use that tab to add or delete perspectives, toggle the display of implicit measures, add measures that use aggregate functions, and a lot of other options within the PowerPivot model. You can also configure the data type for a calculated column, and you can hide columns from client tools. And in this case, it prevents the user from accessing that field. The column remains in the data view in the PowerPivot window with a gray background, but you can toggle its visibility in the data view by clicking that Show Hidden button on the Home tab of the ribbon. Now you can also opt to show details for the selected value. If you right-click a numeric value in the Excel window and then select Show Details, you can open a separate worksheet listing the individual rows that were used in order to calculate that value. And the feature really only works for simple aggregates, such as sum or count. And then there's a number of enhancement to DAX. These are the data analytics. These are the data analysis expressions. And that's the expression language you use when you create calculated columns, measures, and KPIs, or key performance indicators, for tabular models and PowerPivot models.